Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 5 Ways Technology Can Support Facilities Maintenance, Sustainability, and Security. I'm Jennifer Getz, the Editorial Director of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar is presented by TMA Systems. Before we get started, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. Please note the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions via the question box at any time. There will be a Q&A portion after this presentation, so please type your questions there to send them to us. If at any time you experience a technical difficulty, please send us a message via the question section and someone on our team will answer you privately. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of your control panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the control panel, so please be sure the panel is expanded so you can access the question box. And if you are interested in continuing education credits, please note that you'll receive a certificate of attendance and an email from Facility Executive after this webinar. You can report to your association for the credit. Now I'll introduce your speaker. Joe McVeigh rejoined TMA Systems in January as the product manager and is responsible for gathering feedback from their customers and planning their product roadmap. Joe has over 10 years of experience in the CMMS industry, including 7 years as a senior implementation consultant for TMA. He has worked primarily with customers in higher education, government, healthcare, and manufacturing throughout his career. Hello, Joe, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Jen. Thanks everybody for attending. So before I move off the kind of intro slide, I'll just kind of give some additional background of how I got started. So my first job in the CMMS industry was, it's over 10 years ago, but it was a short-term contract. It was a 1-year contract in Washington, DC, actually. So I knew a little bit about databases and some of our software, obviously, but got sent out there on a 1-year contract thinking, surely I'm going to find some other kind of job to do. And, you know, over the time I spent there, the contract got extended a few times, and I just found out, you know, I really loved being in facilities maintenance. So it was a lot of fun walking through the buildings and knowing the folks who had the keys to all the doors, which we'll talk about in a future slide. But yeah, just kind of really enjoyed working with all the tradespeople, and I'll say I have a deep and abiding appreciation for all the trades folks after working so closely with them for so many years. You start to realize what actually makes a facility run, and a lot of times people don't see it. It's behind the walls and above the ceilings. So again, just really enjoy working with trades folks. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started here. So the agenda for today, we have our kind of 5 takeaways, and we'll be talking about proactive facilities maintenance. So just ways of hopefully streamlining your operations a little bit, making them a little more efficient. With that in mind, obviously, we want to talk about sustainability as well. So that's a hot button topic in the industry of, you know, energy and usage, things like that. So we'll touch on that some. Building security being another one. So a couple of ways to look at that, managing people's access to your buildings. Analytics and reporting, something that's kind of close to my heart now. It's something we're working on internally. So really important aspect of a CMMS system, enterprise asset management, all those kinds of systems should have really good reporting. And then finally, technology to leverage. And we'll kind of have a summary there, and at the end we'll do a Q&A. So hopefully you all kind of fill up the chat, and yeah, any questions you all have, we'll do them a little bit later in the presentation. So happy to answer any questions that you have. Just the last thing I would kind of say as part of the intro here is, you know, now I have the role of a product manager, so we're gathering feedback for new features and things like that. You know, previously I was an implementation consultant, so all of the knowledge that I've gained throughout my career was really visiting with customers. So there's still plenty of stuff I'm sure I don't know. Hopefully less than there was 10 or 12 years ago. But yeah, that background has been helpful in my new role as well. So with our first takeaway, the tagline I put here, just, you know, really emphasizing that the best facilities maintenance operations, and it is unfortunate, but you don't notice it. So a lot of people take for granted that things are always working in their buildings. So I bet for the folks on this call that work in facilities, I bet it's pretty rare that you get the phone call and somebody is reporting that the temperature in their office is just perfect, or everything is working properly. And we usually get the opposite kind of call. So unfortunately, it kind of sets up this dynamic where people don't really realize how great a job a lot of our facilities operations are doing, because they don't notice when things are going as planned and when things are working properly. So it's something I always like to call out, because facilities maintenance, the budgets are constrained, and we'll talk about that in future slides in a lot of cases. And it's for this reason, where a lot of people just don't notice all the work that goes in and how important it is. So with that being said, one of the first things that I try to do when I was a consultant, especially, is find choke points in our workflows that are making things kind of sit on somebody's desk for too long. And it's usually not sitting on somebody's desk because they're being negligent. People have other jobs to do than just be looking at the work order system at all times. So some things that I've implemented in the past is, having some workflows. In some cases in a system, you'll have a workflow engine that can handle this. So knowing to auto assign particular work orders, if we know that that work order is within a particular trade, I know a technician is close to it. And, obviously in some cases they'll need the proper training and certifications to actually perform the work. So, if it's high voltage electricity, something like that. But we can take some of that criteria and then set up a workflow where we can just skip past a dispatcher or even a maintenance manager and just pre-assign some of that work when we can. Obviously there's some work we don't want to pre-assign. So I don't want to send stuff directly to the tech in all cases. So you just always want to take that into account when you're setting something like this up. Another thing that we do pretty often, and this is a way to kind of avoid that issue I was describing, where we don't want to auto assign the tech, but I may want them to know about it. So we can set up a queue of work orders, hopefully on a mobile device. So when it gets submitted or we see that work order gets created, we know enough about it that it's within a particular trade, for example, that we just give them a queue that they can always monitor. So if they're in a particular building, they just finished a work order, that they go ahead and just take a look at that work order queue, and if they can, just grab it and grab that work order, perform it while you're in the area if you have time to do it. Now, finally, we want to do the pre-assignment of any scheduled maintenance to the extent that we can. So we should have a pretty good handle on when our preventive maintenance stuff is going to generate, and hopefully within a week or two before generation, we've already got an idea of who the staff will be that's going to take care of it. So pre-assign as much of that stuff as we possibly can. So again, we don't have those choke points of work orders sitting on somebody's desk, whether that's a maintenance planner, a dispatcher, maintenance supervisors, whoever you have assigning some of that work. We can automate this to the extent that we can. That's always going to be a good thing. So this one in particular is kind of near and dear to my heart. So this would be something I was always trying to emphasize when I was implementing CMMS systems, which is this first bullet point being track your PM repairs. So I want to know how those repairs were identified. Where did they come from? What was the source of it? And ultimately what caused them, and we'll talk about that with failure codes here in a minute. But I would frequently see in visiting different sites that a technician, they're being proactive to the point of the takeaway here. So it's good in a sense, but they're finding kind of major repairs when they're doing preventive maintenance. And the technician will just make that repair and consider it part of the PM ticket. And we lose a lot of data and information that way. So what we want to do in those cases is hopefully the software is set up in such a way where we can kind of automate the creation of a corrective work order. But in any case, we want a corrective work order created to show that type of repair, and we want to categorize it properly. So at the end of the year, I want a count of those things. I want to see how many repairs did we find while we were doing our preventive maintenance. And the last part of this point is it tells me how effective my preventive maintenance is. I can directly point to that list of things that I prevented, equipment failures that we didn't end up having because I'm doing my preventive maintenance. So, in some cases, we'll find some inefficiencies if we're doing PMs too often. Sometimes we're not doing them often enough. So having data like this can really help you justify what you're doing with your PM scheduling. So PM repairs as a work order type, I always recommend, however you all want to categorize that. But typically, that should not fall within the preventive maintenance work order. I want that additional data. And while it can be painful on the tech, that data is worthwhile for me. So want them to create those corrective work orders, or obviously have them auto-created if possible. So our next bullet point here is using failure codes. And this gives me the context of what caused the piece of equipment to fail. So the nice thing about this is gradually as we use this more and more and we kind of refine our list of failure codes, we're going to be able to start spotting some trends on what is commonly failing on a particular item. Now, typically in most systems and most CMMS or enterprise asset management systems, they will have some form of kind of nesting here. So I say failure codes, but what I really mean is I want to know the failure, I want to know what caused the failure, and I want to know the resolution. So what did the tech do to fix it? So it's kind of that nested root cause analysis. And gradually, as we start filling that stuff in, we're going to build a bit of a knowledge base of, if I have a new tech starting and they're trying to figure out what happened on a particular piece of equipment, I should have some data to be able to show them that the most common cause or the most common failure is this. It was most commonly caused by that, and it was most commonly fixed by whatever procedure we used. So I want to get that data so I can hand it off to my techs. It's going to help them troubleshoot much, much better. There's another aspect of this that's extremely valuable, though. I can start spotting some trends about maybe a particular component on a piece of equipment. So in some cases, and I've worked with customers where they got down and were able to identify what was a particular manufacturer, and they were able to improve their equipment downtime numbers by just switching to a different manufacturer of a part, or in some cases approach the manufacturer, their vendor, and get some rebates, if you will. So failure codes can be extremely helpful in that way. Lots of data that you can pull out of failure codes. IoT devices, so this is a huge trend in the facilities area. So I'm sure everybody's kind of heard of this. It's a bit of a buzzword now, and standing for Internet of Things, of course. And a lot of customers are wanting to kind of go towards this as a way of doing their predictive maintenance as opposed to preventive maintenance. So to just briefly explain the difference, I'm sure many folks on this call are very aware, but preventive maintenance is typically going to be like your manufacturer recommendations. So, we check it quarterly. So we'll just kind of have some hard and fast schedules that we do for particular types of equipment or whatever the manufacturer is telling us to do. Now, an IoT device is going to be a little bit different in that it can predict failures. So to take the example of an air handler unit, we're having to go and replace those filters, and preventive maintenance would have said, well, we'll just do it every 3 months. We'll do it quarterly, for example. There are IoT devices that are installed in those building automation systems that I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with, where it could measure the pressure differential of your filters. So maybe I'm just getting a reading telling me when the filter is dirty, and I'm only changing it then. I'm not changing it quarterly. I'm changing it exactly when it needs to be changed. And you can imagine in vehicles, all sorts of equipment, there are those kinds of metrics that can tell me when to do preventive maintenance, and only exactly then. So I'm not just guessing. I'm not going with the quarterly or the manufacturer recommendation. I'm taking a hard and fast metric and doing the work just when those conditions are met. So IoT, it depends. A lot of places will have these devices and building automation systems and things like that, but they're not, commonly or not always integrated with a CMMS. So we'll talk about that here in a future slide as well. So when I'm talking about the proactive facilities maintenance here, one of the key takeaways that I want to emphasize is refining PM schedules. So again, we talked about constrained budgets and maintenance groups. I've yet to see the facility manager that thought that they had everything they could possibly need in terms of labor force and everything to take care of every conceivable reactive repair, preventive maintenance that they have. So it's really important to try to find these efficiencies, and one of those places you can find it is in PM schedules. So even if you don't have that Internet of Things, IoT devices installed where I'm getting that just perfectly telling me exactly when to do it, that doesn't mean that we can't use some data to start trying to calibrate our PM schedules a little better. So I mentioned those PM repairs before. If I'm checking something every 6 months and I never see corrective work orders coming out, potentially I'm doing it too often, and maybe we start, looking at 9 months or 8 months, and we just keep an eye on, how many of those repairs are we identifying when we're going and doing our PMs. The opposite can also be true. If every single time I'm going, I'm finding, major failures or potential major failures, I'm either right on target or maybe I'm not going often enough. So maybe we switch this to 4 months. We just start tinkering a little bit of, let's just prevent the failures. Let's try to be as efficient as we can when we're assigning our technicians, because the labor in a facilities operation is the most valuable resource. We want to make the best use of their time. And then secondly, if you do have that technology, try to leverage it. So if you do have some of the IoT devices, if you have a building automation system that's capable of doing some of these things, start pursuing those integrations so that you can do predictive maintenance. Just-in-time maintenance is going to be a little more efficient, for obvious reasons, where we're still preventing major equipment failures, but we're doing it just when we need to, and not, something maybe recommended by a manufacturer, for example. So with that being said, we'll kind of move into the next one. I always go long when I talk about the proactive facilities maintenance, so I'll probably run through these a little faster so we still have the Q&A. But sustainable facilities management, very obvious. We want to expend our resources in the most efficient manner possible. Utilities is kind of plays a huge part, obviously, in sustainability, but I'll speak to a few other things as well. We already talked about labor in the previous slide. So the first thing I would recommend, and many of you probably would have it at your organization, but it's having an energy management system. A lot of CMMS, EAMs, things like that will have a module for it. But honestly, on my travels, I've seen it just as commonly and probably even more commonly that an organization is using a specific standalone software system to track their energy management. So they will have all of that utility usage data in there from their utility tickets. And this is extremely valuable to have. All of, leadership at all organizations are wanting to see that type of information. Because, in a lot of cases, we can get justification for funding to reduce energy usage for multiple reasons. It's good for the environment and it's good for our budget. So it's a win-win. So if you don't have one, this is certainly something to take a look at. Try to find, whether it's a standalone product or something within a CMMS EAM. So on that second bullet point, this is where we're more talking about, if you do have that standalone, I highly recommend to integrate that with your CMMS system. And the reason I say this is setting your energy usage data alongside your work order data, your maintenance data, is extremely beneficial. It tells me all sorts of information about what's going on in my different buildings. So to give kind of an example here, I worked with a university that had a project where they were going to replace all the light bulbs in a sports arena with LED lighting. So we had an energy management system where we could track all the usage, but we didn't have the context of what changed and how much did it change after we did some of our capital projects. So once we replace all that lighting, now we see a significant drop in the electricity in the building. I can take that data, go back to leadership, and justify more capital projects with that type of a goal in mind. So extremely helpful. The opposite is also true. So, if we have major water leaks, just inefficient equipment in different buildings, our maintenance data will tell us that. And again, it just gives that context of your utility usage. So setting those two pieces of information alongside each other is really important to me if you're going to have something actionable to do after taking a look at, okay, well, this building has extremely high energy costs. Well, I bet something in your CMMS system would tell you why that is. And then the third item here, so just managing your storerooms. It's a little different than what we're talking about with the energy management, but think of all the stuff that you have on your shelves that you don't necessarily need to have. So when I look at a lot of organizations' storerooms, I notice that they are stocking parts that maybe aren't critical and they're easily sourced. So for instance, if we were looking at the shelf and I know that this part is not critical, so if we didn't have this, it's not like I'm preventing an equipment failure or anything like that. But the other thing is, I know I have 9 suppliers for it. I could throw a rock in any direction and have it on the dock tomorrow. So there's no point in keeping that on your shelves if you don't have to. So go through and really kind of analyze what you have on your shelves. And obviously there are certain things where it is a critical part and we may not have, a short lead time. So it takes 3 weeks to get something shipped to us for this. Well, absolutely. That's the sort of thing we absolutely need to have on our shelves. And I'd be willing to bet there's a lot of stuff that you don't need on your shelves. So again, just kind of emphasize, manage that storeroom. You can get a lot more sustainable and help your cash flow and budget and everything by working on those inventory levels. So our next takeaway, we'll talk about building security just for a moment. One of the things that honestly we don't talk about as much, a lot of times I don't in some of the presentations I give at our user conferences and things, but it's a really, really key part of being a good facilities maintenance organization. So there's the cost aspect of just losing keys, having to rekey buildings. I'll have a brief story here in a minute about losing grandmaster keys. Things like that is extremely expensive, not to mention some of the liability issues there. But then the other aspect of it is to protect your assets, the equipment that you have. Those things are really expensive. We need to keep them working. I don't want people in there that shouldn't be. But the building occupants. So whether that's somebody coming into your facility that shouldn't be coming into the facility, or just making sure that they can't get access to areas where they could cause themselves some harm. So having worked a lot in higher education, the students are often curious. And if we didn't keep some of those mechanical spaces really tightly locked down, there would be potential for some significant injury. So really important topic. And when I look at this, there's really kind of the 2 main things that I've seen. So you kind of have the interchangeable cores, that hard key access to your different buildings. And we'll talk a little bit about the electronic key card access. So I've worked with facilities where it was 100% either or. So it was only the interchangeable type cores that you see, or 100% electronic key card access. But I've probably worked with more or just as many that have a hybrid, kind of a mix of this stuff. So to speak first about the interchangeable cores, that hard key access, being strategic in the way you set up your keyways is going to mitigate some of the risk of losing keys. So, if I can separate my custodial spaces from mechanical spaces, from residential, from office, all that kind of stuff, keep them on their own keyway, I'm not going to have as big of a problem in the event of a lost key as I otherwise would if I keep everything on the same keyway. So still not great if I have to recore every door that's a custodial space, for example, but it's a heck of a lot better than doing an entire building. And I have seen with a contractor, actually. So I was working with a facility, and they had a contractor, and it was a really large facility. They had a contractor lose a grandmaster key for a particular building. And after calculating everything they had to do, it was something like, I want to say it was $200,000 to rekey the entire building. So huge, huge problem if you're not setting this stuff up properly, and then having processes in place of how do these get issued, who has them, what doors do they open. Keeping track of all that stuff is really important. So to that next bullet point, have key cabinets or key tracking systems. So the key cabinets, they can be, fairly analog, where I take my key and I put it in my key cabinet before I can access another key that's going to open different spaces in the building. So there's no real software involved, but it would tell me if somebody lost that key, well, they can't get their key out. So we're going to know who took that key and who's the last person with it. And again, it's analog, but it works. So I know who took the key, and then we can kind of hold them responsible as needed. Key tracking systems, though, also. So there are, some systems that have software behind them. So it's very similar, where you might, scan your ID card, and that will unlock a particular key. And the main benefit, as opposed to just doing the kind of simpler key cabinets, is I have some reporting that I can do with that. So I will know, who checked what out, how often, that kind of stuff. So those are, effective too, and something you can take a look at. And then finally, as I'm always pitching, hopefully there is a module of some kind in your CMMS, because again, this is pretty relevant to all the other maintenance stuff that we're doing. So managing your keys in a system. Ultimately, somebody at some point is going to ask, I want to know who has access to what keys and what doors those keys will open. Databases are very good for that kind of information, so something to pursue. And then we have the electronic key card access. So this is obviously kind of a preferable way to go for a number of reasons. But in my experience, we saw some price tags to do electronic key cards on an entire higher ed campus, for example, and those price tags are pretty extensive. So that can be difficult to get some of these things implemented. I do think it's worth considering the investment for, again, some of the reasons we've already mentioned, and others, that ultimately managing all of your key biddings, buying all those key blanks, having the cores, all of that stuff, that isn't necessarily cheap either. So you can justify that expenditure, in my opinion, especially once you look at all the kind of liability type issues that we can eliminate. So if we are able to fully lock down a building, whenever we want from a control panel, usually a security group will have access to that. It's extremely beneficial. And I think of K through 12, I think of higher education. There's a lot of places where this is absolutely relevant. Corporate campuses too. Being able to lock down the facility with a click of a button can be extremely beneficial and protect people quite a bit. So something to consider. But the other things, some of the more mundane things, when we have contractors coming in, they will need keys. And in my experience, a lot of times they'll come and check out the key, and they never return, and we'll never see that key again. Well, if we can do this with an electronic key card, we can set an expiration date. And I kind of still want them to return at the end of, their work is going to have them here till end of business Friday. I would rather they return the key, but if they don't, it's not going to work the next day. So I've eliminated some risk there. So again, I would highly recommend, it's something to consider, the electronic key card access systems. I'm sure they've gotten even more impressive since the last time I looked at one. So our next takeaway, we're going to talk about analytics and reporting. So this is, typically when I'm working with technicians, this is the kind of question that they will ask. Why are we doing this? We have a lot of button clicks. You're having me create all these corrective work orders, all of this stuff where, in their opinion, a lot of times it is an imposition on their job. They're having to fill out tons of data, and they're not always seeing why they're filling it out and understanding why. So ultimately, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow with any software system, I would hope, and especially CMMS and EAM type systems, is good reporting. That should be our goal. We want great reports coming out of the system that are meaningful and actionable for our leadership. So I'm not just talking about lists of information. I mean things that give me real context where I can make a decision, a business decision, based on what I'm getting out of the system. Yeah, so we have all this data, now what? And I've had that conversation with a lot of different customers after we set up, some complex business processes, and we got all sorts of windows and things that they're going to. So business intelligence and analytics tools have really risen and obviously are kind of trendy at the moment, and they are pretty slick. So some systems have their own kind of proprietary report writer tool, and in a lot of cases those are still useful. But there's a lot of things out there. There's Looker, you have Tableau, there's just plenty of different vendors that are just standalone business intelligence and analytics tools that are worth considering if you don't already have them. And there's a good chance that somebody in your organization has something like this and they're just using it for another purpose. So, whether it's HR or accounting or something, they need reports as well. So it's possible your organization might already have something like this. And then you can just utilize it for facilities type data. So most facility managers, they want the graphical KPI type stuff. And we have a little kind of look at some of the dashboard type stuff that we do in the background there. But that's what they're looking for. Because ultimately, I could give them the list of the 20,000 work orders that we did, and I could give them some simple counts, but that's not what they want. They want a one-pager that has some graphs where they can kind of get a very firm view on what is going on in the facility and what to do next. So these tools are really what they're looking for. The lists of data don't really work anymore. Giving them a spreadsheet that we now need to manipulate, that's not really what we want. We want those graphs kind of pre-built. And I mentioned this third bullet point of eliminate the need to run these end of month reports. So I'd be curious, maybe when we get in the Q&A session, I'd be curious how many folks have this issue. So in my experience in traveling and visiting different customers, it was not uncommon at all for me to work with kind of trade supervisors who at the end of the month are working out of spreadsheets and trying to produce some of these metrics that their bosses are asking for. And, ideally, we do not want that happening. So, certainly administrators, maybe the facility managers are going to need to do some, maybe some Excel work and some report writing stuff, but down to my trade supervisors and certainly technicians, I want a much better use of their time. And BI tools, report writing tools in your CMMS system should be able to take care of this. That is an absolute expectation to me, that we be able to write the kind of report that we need. When we schedule it for end of month or end of quarter, and we don't need our trades folks interacting with these reports really at all. Obviously, they should understand what's in them, but they shouldn't be responsible for creating them. So taking that burden off our techs, make the best use of their time, which is usually, I'm willing to bet it's not Excel. Huge benefit to the organization. And then the last point here, that our analytics tools, we can take multiple data sources from different systems. And, we were talking about like our energy management system, for example, and then take some data from your CMMS. You have HR systems, you have all sorts of systems where you can bring all of that in, combine those data sources. And once you start setting some of those data sources alongside each other, then your reporting can get really, really interesting, because you may have some really important data, it's just stored somewhere else. Once you put that next to some of your work order or preventive maintenance data, now you've got something you can really take a look at. So I think I lost my photo, but I can go through the bullet points either way. So A reporting example here that I'll give is this work order backlog. So this is one where this was pretty much every implementation I did, we would have some discussion around this. So ultimately, a work order backlog should be a number of hours and not a count of work orders, right? Not all work orders are the same. So if I give 100 work orders to a technician, it seems like they're overloaded, and maybe they are. But if it were 100 fire extinguishers, like they could probably do that, pretty quickly. Where I could give them an annual boiler PM, and they may be working on that for quite a bit longer. So we want to always record the average time it takes to complete your PM task, for example, just so we have a metric, because that should be somewhat predictable. We do it often enough. I should kind of know, on average, how long does it take us to do this particular PM task. But we take that, we multiply it against every asset that we have, and we sum it up for the month. And I should have a nice chunk of hours where I know that, let's say, it's 1,000 hours of preventive maintenance work for August. Then what I would typically do is I'll average the number of hours that we spend on reactive maintenance per month. So I look at last year's data, and I'll just take an average of the service requests that are coming in, the random repairs that we have to do. And that should give me something to kind of look at. And I'll take that and I'll put it next to the sum of hours that I have for my preventive work. Now, this is where you might have another system that has available labor for the month. So we have timekeeping systems, HR systems. So project how many labor hours do you have for that month? Well, I know what my planned maintenance is. I have a guess, a pretty good educated guess on what my reactive maintenance is. How about my labor hours? How does that match up? So this is a great exercise to take to, and a great report to take to, the leadership, and just say, something is probably going to have to give here. So if I have 20,000 hours worth of work and I have 15,000 hours worth of people, we can make up some maybe with overtime. There's contractors, and in many cases, we're going to have to choose some PMs that aren't going to be done. But at least we're making an educated decision. So we'll take that, those fan coil units and the that we have in corridors, things like that. Maybe we let those go for this month. We're not as concerned. So pick some of that stuff that we're kind of more in the run to fail type situation, and start taking those off the list till you have a reasonable workload for your workforce. Okay, and then the kind of final topic here, and then we'll get into some Q&A stuff, but leverage the technology. So CMMS, and we have a lot of things in adjacent spaces. So I'm sure you've heard the IWMS, we have enterprise asset management. There's all sorts of descriptions for these types of systems. But they're, typically expensive, or at least a lot of the good ones are, and they can be really difficult to implement. So I have painful experience with that too, because you take large organizations, with 100 buildings, let's say, there's thousands and thousands of pieces of equipment, and even more schedules, PM schedules and things like that on top of it. So it is a huge commitment to implement this kind of software. It's worth it. I should certainly hope so, given my position, but it is worth it. There is a return on investment at the end of the day, but it's a commitment that's going to take a while. So identify your capacity to deal with that kind of interruption in your processes, and leverage this technology to help everybody in the organization. Ultimately, I can usually win the techs and the maintenance supervisors over by the end of the implementation. Maybe at the beginning, they're not as keen on it, but usually by the end, I can show them that their lives are going to get a little bit easier if we implement the software properly. So just a few things I would recommend as you guys are looking at systems like this, and I don't know how many out of the group are kind of in a transition looking for a different system or evaluating their own system, but I start with where I want to finish. And what I mean by that is, ultimately, we talked about it in the previous takeaway. What I want out of my software is great reports. And we should know what those reports are. I bet if you sat down with leadership and some of the supervisors, that you guys could make the list of these are the reports and KPIs that I want. Let's start with that, because that's what I want at the end of the day. And it may be a 6-8 month implementation or whatever it is, but at the end of that 8 months, these are some of the things I absolutely have to have, and they're reports ultimately. So let's make a list of those things. And that's going to make it much, much easier for me to evaluate a different system or the system that I have. Can I get those reports? So another thing that I think is kind of an interesting trend in the industry is the notion of integrating instead of consolidating. So I'm sure many of you on here that there are huge monster systems, ERP systems, things like that, that do everything. They have, they can handle HR, they do all the accounting. They have bolt-ons for everything you could possibly imagine. They have your capital project stuff, and they have a CMMS, and they have space management. So you see a lot of those really bulky, huge systems out there. And what I've started noticing is aspects of those systems that they're not doing extremely well are breaking off into their own kind of component parts. You can have a big ERP that handles just the things it does extremely well. And then maybe you have a CMMS or an IWMS that handles just the things it does extremely well, and start to integrate those systems. So integrations can be a little painful to get set up at times, but it's worth considering. I would rather have systems that do exactly, they're specialized in what they do, as opposed to a system that does 50 things that probably doesn't do all 50 things well. I would rather kind of bolt a few of those together for the systems that really do their core features extremely well. And then perform these regular system audits. So taking a look at the CMMS or EAM, all the acronyms, look at that stuff at your own organization and do this regularly. And maybe it's once a year, maybe once every 2 years, whatever's feasible for you. Now, sometimes that system is perfectly adequate to handle your needs, and there's not really a need for you to move. Maybe you didn't structure your data properly, so you have things like redundant lookups and types and things like that, where your reporting is suffering because you just didn't set it up properly. Some of it is training. We don't have good processes to handle, who we issued keys to, for example. So it doesn't always mean that the system you have is not a good one. But the last sentence I put here, and it's always, I don't typically try to say this to customers, although sometimes I do think it, but not all problems are software problems. So when you're doing that evaluation, is it training? Is it management of our folks? Or is it really something missing in the system? And I'm not going to say that there aren't improvements that we need to make in our software and all sorts of stuff. That is constantly true. But it's often also true that, it's not something that should be handled by software exactly. So that being said, I think I came in. Yep, we do have some time for questions. So thanks everybody for listening. I guess I'll kind of pose it back to Jen or the group if we've got some questions.
Thank you, Joe, for this presentation today, and thank you to all attendees for sending in questions. As Joe mentioned, we'll now have some Q&A to address the questions that you have sent in, and please continue to submit any questions that you may have. Okay, so to start off, Joe, you talked about refining preventative maintenance goals when talking about proactive facilities maintenance. How might that differ between different industries, like healthcare as opposed to education, for example?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And one thing I think I briefly mentioned, but didn't go into it fully, and that is there's a lot of regulatory requirements that affect what you can do. So with healthcare, for example, there are regulations around certain things that you have to check. You have to abide by the manufacturer recommendations or go through a process of documenting why you don't. So it's not always worth your time to do that when it's regulatory type of preventive maintenance. And in other industries and education, any kind of facilities, you'll have fire protection systems, things like that, where you just can't deviate. Even though we checked our emergency generator once a week and never had a problem for 7 years or whatever it is, that doesn't mean you can just stop checking it once a week. So there are certainly times when you can't make those kinds of adjustments because the risk of a failure is just too large, and or that a regulatory agency is requiring you to do something.
Perfect. Okay. I have another question here for you. You mentioned doing system audits and having good data structure. Can you expand on what that might look like?
Yeah. So it's a service that your software company may provide, but it's also something I think, for the folks that are administrators and really familiar with their CMMS, they can likely do themselves. But go through, and I always look at the filter points of a report. So if I run my end of month, end of year, end of quarter type reports, and I'm noticing some inaccuracies, or I'm getting questions from leadership of, hey, that doesn't really make sense, I don't think that adds up, those should start to point to issues that we're having in the system. And again, it could be training, but in some cases, we just didn't set up our database properly. So, we may have air handlers, and then we have air handler units, and then we have AHUs, where we just make all these redundancies throughout the system, and then my reporting suffers, everybody gets upset, and in a lot of cases, they'll say, well, this system is terrible. And sometimes it is, but not always. Sometimes you can fix some of those data structure issues, hopefully, pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. So yes, so thank you so much. I believe we have one last question. So you did mention that, sometimes like CMMS implementations can be painful to set up at times. Might you have any recommendations on how this can be alleviated so the process is as painless as possible?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of things that I would highly recommend is really that first thing I was mentioning is, on the customer side of it, you all need to have a really good team together. And one issue that I've seen in my previous experience is, for instance, like the IT group might be the one selecting the vendor just because it's software. Well, that's a bad decision. I'm not saying they shouldn't have a role. Obviously, it impacts their department as well. But the maintenance department should be heavily part of that committee. So kind of get a committee together that has all of the information they need to make the right selection. But have your ducks in a row in terms of the reporting that you're looking for. So know exactly what you're looking for, then you can guide that consultant to set up your data properly, set up the system properly, train your folks properly to get the reports that you're asking for. And then the last kind of point I would make on that too is be realistic and prioritize the certain things that you need day one. And we mentioned key management, for example. That might be a really difficult module to set up. Well, if we phase our implementation properly, we may not need that day one, but we need our preventive maintenance or our work request portal or whatever it is. Stage those things appropriately. So you're adding a little more at a time. Don't try to do everything at once.
Great. Okay, we have another question here. Any suggestions for good key tracking systems other than using an Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah, so I guess part of the question would be, whether you have the electronic key card access or the interchangeable cores. There's one when you have the actual hard key access. It was a literal system called KeyTrack, as I recall, and I saw it in a few facilities, and it was pretty slick. So I think it was Key, T-R-A-K, and it was essentially you'd scan your ID card and it would unlock certain keys for particular doors. And then we actually had some software where we knew who had checked out what key, how often did they check it out, what was the window of time they checked it out. So if we had to kind of look back, maybe something happened 3 months ago, and I was really curious who had this key checked out. We'll have it in a system like that. Other than that, I can't remember some of the names of the electronic key card systems, to be honest. So I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of those vendors off the top of my head, but there's plenty.
Thank you. Here's another one for you. Is it better to implement a CMMS system during construction or during operational?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So I guess it would depend on some of the facilities. I'd be curious to know what type of facility we're talking about there. But honestly, I would say the earlier the better. And part of the reason, so let's say if we're constructing a big manufacturing facility, and this is something I've had a little experience with, is, those contractors that are building out the facility, a lot of times if you work with them in advance, they're probably producing, AutoCAD, or in some case Autodesk, like Revit, BIM, building information models that contain all of your data. And sometimes you can work with them in advance. In fact, it's something we do pretty frequently for a lot of universities are building new buildings. But they'll make it a requirement, it's part of the contract with the construction company, that you will provide us a model that has all of our equipment data, all of our location data in this particular format available for me. And you can take that data and directly import it into your CMMS if they have that facility to do it. Mm-hmm. So I would probably say in construction, at the same time though, if you're not in operation yet, you don't know what you don't know. So it could be really, really difficult to train and implement work order processes before you actually need them. So, gosh, it's a really good question. I would almost go like half and half. I would start getting my data together during construction. I would wait a little bit to set up my business processes until after we were operating, probably.
And then I just got word that it was that question was asked in regards to a commercial office building.
Oh, okay. Yeah, interesting. And I think I would still go with that kind of hybrid answer of I would start it as you're building. Because again, that contractor, they should have plans that, as built, all that kind of stuff that should have the data that you'll need to set up your system. The earlier you get that stuff, the better, because that can really slow down an implementation. It's just getting the data properly. So if you were doing that before you were already operating, that would be a good time to start. But I would wait till I did any kind of training until you were actually in operation, because I forget stuff I learned 4 days ago. So we don't want to do stuff too far in advance in terms of training.
Great, great. And I think we have time for one more question. Can you say more about integrate versus consolidate for software systems?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take an example of procurement systems and purchasing systems, for example. A lot of CMMSs, and we have purchasing in our system, and a lot of them do. And it's important that you have it because you're managing inventory and all that kind of stuff. At the same time, if you take an example of a university, not everybody at the university is going to use the purchasing system in the CMMS. That CMMS may serve 1 or 2 departments, 3 departments. There's 70 other departments at the university. They're all going to have some other purchasing system. So instead of forcing facilities into a large ERP system, so you'll take something like SAP, may have a module for preventive maintenance. And you can kind of bolt some of those things onto these really large platforms that weren't designed to do it. And in my opinion, that's not the way to go. I would rather use something highly specialized for what somebody needs, and then we'll just integrate with the purchasing system. And you'll see now even things that, I've seen like Coupa and Jagger, there's a bunch of other procurement systems out in space, and they're taking over that one very limited aspect of what ERPs were doing. And, in some ways, TMA and CMMSs are similar to that. There are modules in those really large systems that do some of what we do, but again, they're so big and they do so many things, I bet they don't do it all well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It looks like we are out of time. If your question was not answered today, we will forward it to Joe to address offline. Thank you again, Joe, for your talk today, and to TMA Systems for sponsoring this webinar. And thank you to our audience for attending today. A recording from today's session will be made available on our magazine website, facilityexecutive.com. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.